right. It is Obstructed View, the podcast. And Will Turboff joining us today. And this is going to be a treat because Will comes on my radio show at ESPN Central Texas quite a bit. And he's been a great guy to get to know. And he's a young guy, but he's really done well in his recruiting coverage. And that's why the folks at 247 put him with Bears Illustrated, and obviously he does a lot of work there. And you can follow him at Will Turboff. Will, you look somewhat rested. I mean, have you did you finally get a little sleep after that a crazy day of activity?
I did, yeah. I mean, it is truly a full day. Those letters start coming in at around 6 a.m. for those East Coast guys, which Baylor had a couple of. And it didn't end until about 11 o'clock when Connor Carty, who was, linked to Baylor over the last 48 hours before signing day, ended up signing with Tech. So it was a full day. I'm, it's Christmas for a lot of people, and same thing for me. But after Christmas, you need a little rest, and I'm getting a little bit of that today.
Well, yes, your rest is by coming on with Mosley. I think that's some good R&R. People will have been excited about, like, oh, Mosley, are you going to do like a recruiting wrap up and all this kind of thing? And boy, I thought of you immediately because you've known pretty much all of this class for months, and you were the one in on breaking a lot of the news with these players. There's a lot kind of going, and it's interesting. I see so many stories every year. There was one kid that I had to laugh about. I think he's going to LSU, but he said something like, did you see this video that I'm about to reference? It was a player, and he's talking about, he's glad it's over, and he'd signed with LSU. And then at the end of it, he goes, I'm just a little bit sad that I can't go to Florida State. It's just like, oh man, sometimes you don't have to be completely honest. Most of these
for one day
are very excited. That's right. They can go in the portal at some point if they would like to, but for now, and this is all changing, Will. And I don't want to get too bogged down in, because what these kids are signing now is not a letter of intent. A lot of them are signing, NIL deals. There are buyout clauses now that some of these universities are putting in some of the things they sign. It's different. And but with Baylor, with the signing of the 21 players they signed, let's for now stick with that class. The only breaking news I wanted to start with, Will, and you cover Baylor and you watch this team play, so you know some of the anger out there. But as we record this, we're not far removed from the Big 12 putting out its all Big 12 teams. And, you always, and Will, for people that don't know, Will goes to the University of Texas, but he covers Baylor. But he also, and we started out, Will, did you start out at Nebraska? So you've got a lot of things covered. And, of course, Baylor has their handprints on all that because with Matt Rule now at Nebraska. Now, the Big 12 so you see the Baylor first team guys, and they're all well deserving, and it was exciting to see them. Matt Jones, Keaton Thomas was on there. The punter was on there, and again, just people that make sense. Josh was he's a great special teams player for Josh Cameron for Baylor, so it makes sense that he's on there. First team quarterback is Shedeur Sanders, and also the offensive player of the year. That's fine. Second team quarterback, Sam Leavitt, Arizona State. And you're kind of like, well, that's kind of weird. I mean, certainly Sawyer Robertson's stats compare favorably to him, especially since Sawyer's like top 5 QBR in the country. But okay. Then they apparently put out 3 honorable mention quarterbacks. Retzloff at BYU, Rocco Becht at Iowa State, and Josh Hoover at TCU. I mean, how badly, Will, can you mess things up like this? And I've already reached out to the Big 12 office. I've sounded off on Twitter. The Baylor people are being relatively quiet about this. I guess they don't want to interact with me when I'm feeling a little bit of anger. But it just seems like utter silliness for a guy who fueled this enormous turnaround, and then the Big 12 comes out with its accolades and does not even mention him at any level. Will, were you as surprised by that as I am?
I was very surprised. I had assumed that Sawyer Robertson would be the second team quarterback. Arizona State has had a year, and I'm not so sure it's because of the quarterback play. I think Sam has done a very good job there, and that wasn't always the plan for him to be kind of the guaranteed number one the entire season. That's how it shook out. Even looking at the stats, I don't really see it. Yes, he did put together almost a full season of play, which Sawyer did not, missing those first 4 or 5 weeks. But since then, it hasn't even been close. And then when you get into the honorable mentions and you see Retzlaff, who I think has exceeded any expectations that anyone would have out of him, and Josh Hoover. Josh Hoover is a great player, but TCU did not have the season they were expecting, thanks in part to a lot of the, turnovers and kind of wildness from Hoover. And I don't think if you went to every single Big 12 school, minus maybe TCU, since that's already their guy, and you asked them to choose between Sawyer and Josh Hoover, I think every single team is taking Sawyer. And I think based on this season, again, it's not very close. So Sawyer was one that I was very surprised to not see, on there at all. Bryson Washington, being a first team running back in the Big 12 was always going to be tough. I mean, heading into the season, you assumed that, Devin Neal and Ollie Gordon would have been the two guys by far. Maybe RJ Harvey in that conversation. RJ Harvey did end up making the first team along with Cam Scatabo. And those are two of the best running backs in the country, not just the Big 12. So, a lot of people will say, well, look at the numbers he's put up. Talking about Bryson, he should be on that first team. Unfortunately, they're playing in a conference that may have, better running backs than anywhere else. And I don't, I think when you look at these lists just in general, you say, oh, Baylor only has 3-4 guys on the first team, and they're one of the best teams in the conference. They're the hottest team in the conference. That doesn't seem right. For the most part, I think it was right. It was more of, there's a case to be made that Michael Trick should have been on there based on the way he played in the back half of the season. But I mean, Baylor just came together as a team, and it's a little cheesy, but it was not about the individual performances at all. It was about how those guys on the line play. They moved to a top 15, top 10 offensive line group in the country. The defensive line stepped up. Everyone stepped up, and there were less of look at these stat lines, and then it was more of look at the efficiency rate on the defense.
I agree with a lot of that, but I mean Sawyer in some ways saved everybody, like his performance, and so he stands out like above the rest when you talk about Baylor. And they had some great performances and great players this season. Trigg gets on the second team. I do find it funny, the all Big 12 second team, and it just has Trigg kind of standing there by himself, and you're like, you think of all the tremendous performances. But again, okay, we'll call this portion, Will, the whining Mosley. And the good news about Sawyer is he'll let everybody else be mad, but like I think one of the strengths of his is I don't know if he gives a rip about this. He's not like big on social media at all. And I heard somebody was out there, this will fuel him. I think Colt said that, like, this will fuel him for next season. I don't think so. I don't think he cares. I think he's going to go try to keep being a great player, but if he gets snubbed all the time, so he wouldn't have known what to do if they didn't snub him, right? He's got snubbed at Texas Tech. He got, then he had to leave Mississippi State to come to Baylor, and he gets snubbed for 2 different quarterbacks. And he basically took an injury to get him in the starting lineup, and he's never looked back. So maybe the guy can't even function without being snubbed. It's just sort of part of who he is. Now, this Baylor class, nobody got snubbed. This was and I think, Will, that's one of the remarkable things about all this is that you and I were having conversations when they were at 2 and 4. and I was saying, Will, when are the? I think we both sensed that you were about to have some departures. And even when I asked Dave Aranda about what it was like at 2-4, he just came right out and he said, "Yeah, I know guys were looking around. I know guys in this class were looking around." Will, you even kind of knew who was sniffing around and who they would target first, whether it was Burns, Taz, Kamar, and Morgan. Some of those great DFW players. I mean, you knew where they were. You knew who they were going to lose first because some of the big dogs and the so-called blue bloods were going to come in and target those players. So, Will, just overall to be where the Baylor was and to end up getting, and I know it would have been nice to have the guy who decommitted from A&M. I get that, but still, to put this class to bed, y'all call it the number 2 class in the Big 12. Given where Baylor was a month and a half into the season, is just truly remarkable. One of the most remarkable stories in the country.
Absolutely. I mean, I think when you look at, I can think of 2 weeks in specific after the Colorado loss, after the Iowa State loss, especially after the Iowa State loss and the way that game went, where Baylor looked great in the first quarter, maybe started the second quarter, and then just completely came off the rails. And I think there was a lot of, talks with the players that were committed on, is this a player issue or is it a coaching issue? And if it's a coaching issue, then, obviously we can't stick around. You find out that, maybe the team just needed a little bump. Maybe they needed to lose a game when they called a play called Victory Cigar on a Hail Mary. And, all of a sudden things turn around. They have the 6-game win streak. And, throughout that, Baylor was kind of, I hate to put it this way because it's, kind of unfortunate circumstances for a couple of guys, but they were saved by injuries to their blue chip prospects. I mean, Michael Turner out of Richland, who was, a top 10 running back in the country going into this season, has a leg injury, puts him out for the rest of the year. That kind of deters some schools. Taz Williams has a leg injury. Make sure that some of those other schools who had questions about him but still wanted him in the summer, maybe you're willing to give, Baylor a free ride to signing him. But for the most part, those 2 guys, Caleb Burns, Kamar Morgan, even Jackson Blackwell, Al Lorena, Baylor had maybe double-digit guys who could have found schools that had better records and at the time looked like they had better futures. And whether it was Keenan Hall, whether it was Jamar Chaney, Jake Spavital, whether himself, they made sure to check in with those guys on a daily basis for the most part to make sure that they still saw the vision. And that was the talk all summer. Do you see the vision? Do you trust us? And they trust them at 2-4. They still did. Very few of these guys. Caleb Burns is kind of a weird scenario because you go from being recruited by Baylor and Texas Tech and SMU and these regional schools to Oregon and Oklahoma and Ole Miss. And obviously you've got to take the call at that point. But not a single guy through 6 games did I think doesn't still trust the vision. And they didn't have a single prospect decommit all season.
All right. And boy, you can always hear Will jumps on with us a lot. ESPN Central Texas. He's here on the Obstructed View podcast. I'm looking at some of the players on here, and you just mentioned Burns. There's some guys that we'll talk a lot about. It did seem like Taz Williams, that was a big moment with this class when he kind of surprised everybody and picked Baylor, and it just sent a message like, maybe things really have changed. I think something we've talked about also, Will, Keenan Hall's impact on this class is hard to you almost can't overstate it. He got him back in the DFW corridor, which is that Lancaster, Duncanville, DeSoto, North Crowley, Cedar Hill, just some of the amazing talent. And of course, South Oak Cliff is where he came from, the school where he played. And that, again, that's just huge. And I like that while he owns some of that and doesn't mind, leaning into it, I saw where he was praising one of the Baylor linebacker coaches. I think it was what Jamar Chaney is being able to kind of close, at least on one of those players they were bringing up. Help us, Will, if you would. Who are a couple of the I thought that was funny that one of the groups out there had a list, and I thought, well, Will would have never written that. It was like the best offensive player, and they said Michael Turner, which is fine, but then they said the most like under the radar player, Michael Turner, and I thought, well, that's you can't have like the top best offensive player and then also put him as the most underrated. When you look at this list, who do you think? Who are a couple of players that qualify as those under the radar types that you think will end up making a big impact, sooner rather than later?
One time I was on the radio show and I was out in Cyprus in the middle of the show at a practice for Caleb Burns. And I've seen Caleb Burns for the better part of, say, 14, 15 months now. Baylor was one of the first teams to offer. At the time, I thought he was a great linebacker prospect. I felt like he was a guy that should have had national schools around him, and that he'd be a contributor in year 2 or 3, wherever he went. A year later, I believe that Caleb Burns will be an NFL draft pick 3 years from now, and he'll be taken in the top 3 rounds. There is almost no one better in terms of Texas linebackers than Caleb Burns. With the stats he put up this year, with the improvements he made physically, I mean, this is a guy that reminds me of a Patrick Queen, once a Dave Aranda player at LSU, someone that can just cover the entire field, that can pass rush, that can go back into coverage. He's perfect for this linebacker scheme that they have. He's perfect for what Jamar Chaney kind of leans into in his scheme and what Aranda has done, going more hands-on with the linebackers. So when we look back at this class, and it is, the last week in 2028 or 2029, I do think Caleb Burns will be one of those guys that will say, remember, he was a 3-star prospect for Baylor, and they trusted the process with him. They spent months, trying to get him away from Tech and some of these other schools. They flipped him in late July, and then you had to fend off Oregon and Oklahoma. Michael Turner, like you said, is another one. And he still may be the most underrated guy in this class, at number 17, number 19, somewhere in that area, running back in the country. And like I said, it's largely the bump down was largely in part due to, a pretty bad injury here in the fall. But that's another one where I feel like, with the running back depth in Waco right now, it may take him a year to see a good amount of playing time, and especially coming back from injury. But he'll be a guy that, Bryson Washington has been great. If you get Michael Turner at his, ceiling, he will be one of the best running backs that Baylor's ever seen. Jackson Blackwell is another one who I just feel like already has the size. Once he kind of develops that frame and can figure out, what he's best at. He's a guy that's played 2 ways, and usually once you get them to focus on one side, and he's going to be focusing on defensive line, it's one that he can be a guy that steps up early. And Leo Almanza is another one of those. Played both ways. Looks incredible wide receiver this year. True utility player. But they feel like he'll be a lockdown corner. He's got the vertical. He's got all the moves. So those are 4 guys right there where I feel like when we look back at this class in a few years, you'll say, wow, Baylor didn't have to beat the Alabamas and the Georgias to get him. They had to beat the TCUs and the Kansas States. And those were the most impactful guys.
Boy, I like that. And that's what people love about listening to you, because quite honestly, Will, since these kids were sophomores or juniors in high school, they've been on your radar and at camps and that kind of thing. I told you about a player that's a great running back for 2026 who's just not going to camps, which is an interesting approach. But he's the bottom line is, Will, I think sometimes, and I find myself doing this, I'll see somebody that's being under-recruited, and I try to lobby for them and all. But generally, if somebody's great, they find you, right? Even if you don't get to the camp or something. If somebody's that great, somebody's going to get eyes on you, and you're going to get recruited. Now, all NIL and COVID and so many things have changed how recruiting works. But you're still going to find a way. Now, on that Jackson Blackwell deal. Stay with him for just a second. I thought that, and I was looking over at my notes that I had from the Aranda news conference yesterday. I thought that was interesting when Dave Aranda said that might have been as important as anything that happened was landing a player from Central Texas. And it sounds like a player, a guy with a tremendous upside. But as you know, whether it be Micah Hudson going to Tech, we now know he's probably back on the market, although Joey seems to be suggesting otherwise to a certain extent, maybe still trying to re-recruit him. The Bears just have not landed, even when they do have a commit, like the great player out of Temple, Torian York, who has gone on to become a unbelievable player for Texas A&M. They just don't close the deal locally. Who do you kind of credit? I mean, obviously Baylor's kind of reinforced, but you can't lean on Keenan for everything. You have to have people on the staff that hopefully can do better locally. Have you seen that become a bit more of a focus for this staff in this program, trying to get some guys to stay at home?
I mean, it has to be a focus. There's not a single successful program in the country, even, your Alabamas and your Notre Dames and schools that generally make up the brunt of their, signees out of guys, from all across the country. There's not a single good team that doesn't have a few players within an hour, 2 hours from their school. And recruiting the Metroplex is great. Recruiting Houston is great. Recruiting Austin is great. But getting those guys from Belton and Temple and Waco, that is, in terms of the future of your recruiting, some of the most important things you can do. And now they've gone back to back there with Jaden Porter and Blackwell. And you'd hope that, you've developed a good enough relationship with that staff over Lorena that you can continue to get those guys. But in the next year, it'll be maybe two of their biggest tests if they can really, make their mark in Central Texas with London Smith out of university and Jamarian Vincent, both guys in the top 247. And both guys that have expressed a very deep interest in playing for Baylor, but they need to see the results. And like we've said countless times over the last couple of weeks, the 6-game win streak helps, and especially when it ends your season. And then you get into these junior days and, guys can come in for official visits. So Baylor's going to try to ride this momentum, and they're going full court press for Vincent and for London Smith. You need the entire staff on both those guys. And I think they realize that no matter how good the team is next year, that's going to be one of the most important things if you can lock down, two of the best players to come out of Waco in a long time.
Well, I love that. And we'll keep an eye on that. And I did have, I thought that was interesting. They're going to need to replace some talent. They've obviously got some great wide receivers on this team. But I thought that was interesting that they got 2 wide receivers in this class from the same team. And this team has a history of recruiting out of Shadow Creek. What about those wide receivers? Ja'Cory Watson being one of them, and then Ashton Jones. Bears also like recruiting people named Ashton, if you haven't noticed. I think there was an Ashton Logan that was on the team. But Ashton Jones joins the Bears, and the other wide receiver, Chase Collier, comes out of Jacksonville, Florida. What about the guys Baylor's getting at wideouts?
I mean, this is a much receiver class than anyone expected. You went very light last year. Jaden Porter was the only guy, and that had always been the plan. They were only gonna take 1, maybe 2 wide receivers, and you were gonna go heavy on a very impressive in-state wide receiver class. And in general, a very strong class nationally. And these 4 guys are not the 4 that I don't think anyone, including, people within the program would have expected to have signed with them. Maybe Ashton Jones, who had been linked to them for a long time, is the longest active commit, who signed on Wednesday, had been committed since Christmas Day of 2023. But Ja'Cory Watson, in January and February of this year, was taking visits to Texas and A&M and USC. Chase Collier was a complete unknown. He didn't have any offers until I think early May. Taz Williams, another guy who you would have never expected to be on this signee list. The same thing as Ja'Cory Watson, where he was talking to the Blue Bloods. And Dallas Baker, I think about this time last year when the offensive staff changes happened and everyone else left. Sean Bell was still there for a while. The job at Houston, everyone else left. And I think a lot of people were saying, well, this is the last test for Dallas Baker. He's been here for a while. The wide receiver play has not been elite. And he hasn't recruited incredibly. And not saying that I agree with that at all, because I think Jaden Porter was a great addition last year. And I think the people he's brought in have been great fits for Baylor. But this was the year where he needed to get some big name guys, and getting Ja'Cory Watson, getting Taz Williams, and then, of course, Ashton and Chase Collier. This is a very complete group. You've got a very tall guy in Ashton Jones who could develop into a lot of different things. And you've got two speedsters and three, really, in Collier, Taz, and Ja'Cory Watson. And just like we've been talking about for the last few weeks, this was another sign of Baylor being able to beat out not only Blue Bloods, but the K-States and the Houstons and the Big 12 teams, because you realize that you're going to be recruiting a lot against your own conference. And Baylor's put together a better receiver class than I think anyone in the Big 12.
Okay, and as the Bears look ahead, and you'll take a little bit of a rest, but as you said, you're monitoring 2026 and beyond. Is this a team, do you think that'll they want to win this bowl game, get to 9-4, have the arrow pointed up? This was the best recruiting class ranked since that y'all had ranked at 247. Will since 2019 or something like that. And I mean, where do you think this thing's headed? You just mentioned a couple of players that the Bears are in on locally, but do you sense already some momentum for that 2026? And part of that, you need to keep some of these assistants. So far, so good on that front. But where's the momentum right now with the 2026?
Yeah, we've got an article coming up within the next couple of days on Bears Illustrated about 26 for 26, 26 prospects that could be a part of Baylor's class within the next year. Obviously, they've got 4: Quinn Murphy out of Argyle, Davis Penn out of South Lake Carroll, running back, Rylan Morris, who 24/7 Sports has ranked as a wide receiver, but Baylor feels like is an even better running back prospect, and Cole Seaton out of Mesquite Horn. And that's a more complete class than just about anyone in the country right now, especially in the Big 12. So you look at, like I said, London Smith and Jamarian Vincent, hometown kids. Those are number 1 and number 2 in my eyes. Felix Ojo out of Lake Ridge and Mansfield. There's a few, Isaiah Young from San Marcos, Brock and Tank King out of Port Arthur Memorial. There's players at every position that have taken visits to Baylor, that have been in contact with their regional and positional recruiters. Baylor feels like they have an opportunity to well exceed what they've done in this class and finish, instead of in that, near 30 to 35 nationally, in that 20 to 25. And if you rattle off another 8 or 9 win season, that's a whole lot easier to do, because last year you're presenting a team with a losing record, with a lot of questions about the staff, and they still somehow finished in the top 40. And that's from not really picking up any commits, other than Cabrion Winston and Brody Wilhelm. That was just the trust and the vision that we were talking about earlier on. Now you have the results to show for it. So Baylor is going to be aggressive, way more aggressive than they were in the last year. And I think, this time next year, we'll be looking at a top 25 class.
Wow, top 25. Now that would go back to, it's been a good while since that. And of course, we all remember they were headed toward like a great recruiting class when the scandal hit, and that class certainly went away. But whoa, that top 25 would be building in the right direction. I think it helped in this current recruiting, y'all have the Bears second in the Big 12. UCF, I could not believe. I mean, I knew that class would fall apart, but I saw one ranking that like had them down at 15, and like the same people had them at number 2 recently. So it's great. And again, that just shows you. Sometimes people are like, we want to change. We want a new coach. Be careful what you wish for, because the other side of that is not always pleasant, and it takes a while to get that. So if you can have continuity, build on it, get a new staff. Baylor repaired its image and its staff and its team on the fly instead of firing everybody. They fired some people, don't get me wrong. But anyway, and Tech's trying to do that right now. They fired 2 coordinators and went out and hired 2 of the top young coordinators out there. So there are a lot of teams that try to kind of retool as they go. And right now, the arrow is pointed up for the Bears, as well as Will Turboff. And Will, appreciate this. Always fun to visit with you. Our radio audience has loved having you on over the years, and so this will be fun. Now, your holidays, I hope you'll work a Bears bowl game, perhaps a very close proximity to you if they play at that Texas Bowl in Houston. I think that would be a good one for you. And then I imagine you'll go try to see the Longhorns wherever they end up in this playoff. So, and enjoy, Will, these last title games. Okay, I think the conference title games are going away. Is what it really sounds like. So enjoy this final peek at that Saturday.
I think so too. We've got a good little weekend here. They're nothing more than playoff, play-in games at this point, but still a lot of we play the games for a reason.
I guess so. Although, boy, there's a lot of people that are angry right now with the committee, including the Big 12 commissioner had his. I would like to say to the Big 12 commissioner, let's fix your picking all Big 12 teams before we start, coaching everybody else up. Okay, I shouldn't say that. I like Brett, but I did not like that all Big 12 team and Sawyer being left out of the proceedings at all. But I'll get over it. And the good news is Sawyer probably got over it immediately because that's just how he's wired. Will, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Matt. Yeah, happy holidays.
Same to you. There he goes. Will Turboff on Obstructed View with Matt Mosley.
We are Rogue Media Sports.